Expanding vocational access without a viable path to completion creates a system that locks shut on the very students it claims to serve. The debt trap functions through a structural substitution, where the processing of financing paperwork replaces the achievement of actual educational milestones. In this model, the system forces the student to assume all financial risk, taking on heavy loans and non-refundable fees before a single hour of vocational value is generated. This visualization tracks two distinct trajectories. On the left, financial obligation rises aggressively upon enrollment. On the right, actual progress toward a license fragments and stalls. The divergence between mounting debt and stalled skill creates the conditions where the trap is triggered. A state-regulated trade requires a heavily documented sequential process of learning. Treating that process as a front-loaded consumer purchase ensures entrapment. The historical reality of the beauty trade relies entirely on the physical repetition of touch and strict sanitation. It is not built on abstract theory. Mastering these skills requires intense technical discipline. There are real safety stakes involved when handling complex equipment and chemicals on human skin and hair. Modern institutional marketing often buries this rigorous reality under a soft cloud of dreams. They sell an identity rather than explaining the cold discipline required to earn it. This marketing weaponizes borrowed hope. Low-income and multilingual students are pressured to accept complex financial obligations under the premise that they are simply investing in themselves. By front-loading the financial paperwork while obscuring the operational path to a license, the institution financially captures the student before the first technical lesson begins. Accountable education relies on an unskippable sequence, the licensure chain. It begins with an absolute foundation: hours. State boards only recognize documented physical presence. Raw talent cannot substitute for clocked time. Immediately, a second block, records, must interlock. Undocumented hours are legally void. Hallway talk, verbal reassurances, and glossy brochures have no legal standing. Relying on them destroys the integrity of these first two blocks. Schools that adopt low-cost, documentation-first policies protect the student's investment. They prioritize legally binding records over campus aesthetics. A legitimate vocational school must operate primarily as a documentation engine, securing the student's legal pathway well before celebrating their creative output. Once the internal curriculum is finished, a completion block is added. But notice the stark physical gap between school completion and state eligibility. Completing a school's program is entirely separate from securing a government license. The systemic trap frequently springs in this exact administrative gap. Students are routinely abandoned here, right at the moment their financial utility to the school is exhausted. Crossing this gap requires strict bureaucratic maneuvering, filing state applications, paying distinct board fees, and passing rigid identity verifications. Only by passing the examination do the final licensure blocks lock into place, creating a stable path to income. Ambition alone generates no revenue. The skill only becomes lawful work when every single block in this fragile, state-regulated sequence is interlocked and verified. Working students do not climb this chain in a vacuum. They face intense environmental pressures that assault their progress daily. Hidden operational costs act as physical weights. Childcare, transportation, and lost wages drag down and strain those early links of hours and records. Opaque institutional bundling, like non-refundable kit fees and mandatory supply costs, amplifies these structural weights severely. This creates a fatal chain reaction. A missed work shift leads to a missed payment, which forces a school withdrawal, breaking the hours block entirely. Under the accumulated weight of this interference layer, the entire geometric chain shatters. A failure in any single link negates all previous capital and time investments. The student is left holding the debt, legally barred from entering the profession. The debt trap is a mechanical failure of environmental design. It occurs when a system demands rigid operational perfection, while simultaneously draining the student's financial ability to survive it. To dismantle this, we have to look past the individual student mechanics and examine the macroscopic policy architecture governing how educational funds are distributed. This Sankey diagram illustrates two models. On the left is the prestige model. A massive flow of funds enters an opaque institutional maze, yet only a trickle reaches final licensure. This legacy system favors institutional overhead and campus polish over efficient student outcomes. On the right is the movement model. Here, restricted funds flow linearly and directly through the verifiable geometric blocks of the licensure chain, with zero diversion. This model maintains affordability by eliminating vanity spending, focusing capital exclusively on documentation and licensure readiness. Current funding architectures actively penalize affordable, documentation-heavy schools. They structurally force vulnerable students into expensive mazes simply because those institutions are built to absorb funding. Dismantling this structure requires a shift towards student-following funding. This relies on two constraints. First, funding must be restricted solely to approved direct educational costs. Second, capital must be auditable, released through a metering mechanism. It triggers exact funding bursts only after a progress block is verified. This shifts financial risk back to the institution, receiving capital only when the student progresses toward the license. Tying funding directly to strict state board milestones inherently starves and filters out predatory actors who cannot produce verifiable completion data. Adopting this model forces a change in how we categorize elite vocational education. It should no longer be defined by campus aesthetics, massive marketing budgets, or high tuition thresholds. Elite status is the discipline to maintain an unbroken, documented chain from enrollment to licensure, without straddling the student with catastrophic debt. To dismantle the debt trap, policymakers must stop funding the opaque maze of institutional prestige and fund only the verifiable movement of the working student.